Long before the pyramids reached their full height, and millennia before the written word became common currency, the epic tale of Odysseus's arduous return from Troy was not confined to parchment or papyrus. Instead, it lived on the breath of bards, a vibrant, ever-shifting tapestry woven from song and memory, reflecting the very heart of the Mycenaean age and the tumultuous centuries that followed. Imagine, if you will, a flickering firelight, illuminating faces gathered in a great hall, the air thick with anticipation as a lyre's gentle strumming began. This was the stage for stories like that of Odysseus, tales not recited from a fixed text, but performed, reshaped, and embellished with each telling. This oral tradition was the primary mode of cultural transmission in the ancient world, particularly during what historians refer to as the Greek Dark Ages, roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE. Following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, a period of widespread societal disruption and depopulation, literacy largely vanished. Yet the memory of grand palaces, heroic deeds, and the distant Trojan War persisted, carried forward not by scribes, but by poets and rhapsodes. These storytellers were the living libraries of their communities, entrusted with preserving the collective memory, values, and even the spiritual beliefs of their people. Each performance was a unique event, influenced by the bard's skill, the audience's mood, and the specific occasion. A tale might be condensed for a quick telling, or expanded with rich detail for a long evening's entertainment. The core narrative elements of Odysseus's journey, his cunning, his loyalty, his longing for home, the fantastical creatures he encountered, and the divine interventions that shaped his fate, were like sturdy branches upon which new leaves and blossoms could continually grow. For instance, the Cyclops episode, a vivid and enduring part of the Odyssey, likely existed in various forms long before it was immortalized in the Homeric version. Folklorists and scholars have identified similar motifs of one-eyed giants and clever heroes outwitting them in diverse cultures across the globe, suggesting a deep, ancient root for such narratives. The bards, drawing from this vast reservoir of shared human experience and myth, would adapt these elements, weaving them into the specific story of Odysseus. One might wonder, then, how a consistent narrative could emerge from such fluid beginnings. The answer lies in the remarkable mnemonic techniques employed by these oral poets. They relied on formulaic language, repeated epithets, resourceful Odysseus, rosy-fingered dawn, thematic patterns, assembly scenes, feasting, journeys, and type scenes, armoring, sacrifices, landings on shore. These linguistic building blocks allowed the bards to compose verses on the fly, maintaining the rhythm and meter while focusing on the narrative progression. It was less about memorizing a fixed text word for word, and more about mastering a complex poetic grammar that enabled spontaneous composition within a traditional framework. Imagine a jazz musician improvising within a familiar chord progression. The melody changes, but the underlying structure remains. The very concept of authorship, as we understand it today, was largely absent in this context. The stories belonged to the community, to the tradition itself, rather than to a single individual. The bard was a conduit, a vessel through whom the muse spoke. This is why historians still debate the true identity of Homer. Was he a single, blind poet who synthesized these oral traditions into the monumental works we know today? Or was Homer a collective name, an idealized figure representing a long line of bards whose cumulative efforts shaped the epics? There is no definitive answer, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. A brilliant individual or individuals who, at a pivotal moment, captured and refined centuries of oral storytelling, giving it a definitive shape that could then be transcribed. The transition from purely oral performance to written text was a gradual and revolutionary process, intertwined with the reemergence of literacy in Greece, spurred by the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet around 800 BCE. This new, more efficient writing system allowed for the recording of complex narratives in a way that the earlier, cumbersome linear B script, used by the Mycenaeans primarily for administrative purposes, never could. It's a fascinating thought. Perhaps the very act of writing down these sprawling tales helped to solidify them, to give them the permanence that allowed them to survive for millennia. Before this, the epics were ephemeral, existing only in the moment of their telling, vanishing into the air once the last note faded. The anxieties and values of the Mycenaean Age, a Bronze Age civilization characterized by powerful kings, fortified palaces, and extensive trade networks, are subtly woven into the fabric of the Odyssey. The emphasis on hospitality, the reverence for divine intervention, the importance of lineage and reputation, and the constant threat of piracy and warfare all reflect the realities of that earlier era. Even the concept of a long, perilous sea journey resonates with the maritime nature of Mycenaean power. However, the Odyssey also bears the imprint of the subsequent Dark Ages, a period of decentralization and introspection. The focus shifts from grand battles to individual survival, from the collective glory of war to the profound longing for home and family. Odysseus's personal struggles and his journey of self-discovery speak to a more introspective societal outlook. Consider the role of the gods in the narrative. They are not distant, abstract deities, but active participants, meddling in human affairs with sometimes capricious, sometimes benevolent intent. Athena, Odysseus's divine patron, guides and protects him, while Poseidon, angered by the blinding of his son, the Cyclops, relentlessly pursues him with storms and obstacles. This dynamic interplay between mortals and immortals reflects the ancient Greek worldview, where the divine was inextricably linked with the natural world and human destiny. The gods were reflections of human passions and flaws, magnified to cosmic proportions, and their actions often serve to explain the inexplicable forces of nature or the unpredictable turns of fate. The very structure of the Odyssey, with its non-linear narrative that begins in medias res, in the middle of things, and then uses flashbacks to recount Odysseus's earlier adventures, is a testament to its oral origins. A bard might begin with the most dramatic or immediate events to capture the audience's attention, then fill in the backstory as the narrative unfolded. This technique keeps the audience engaged, constantly revealing new layers of the story. It's a sophisticated narrative device that feels surprisingly modern, even though its roots stretch back to a time when stories were heard, not read. The tale of Odysseus's return was not merely entertainment. It was a pedagogical tool, a repository of cultural knowledge. It taught lessons about perseverance, loyalty, cunning, and the consequences of hubris. It provided models of heroic behavior and warned against folly. The vivid descriptions of mythical lands and creatures, from the sirens' alluring songs to the monstrous Scylla and Charybdis, served not only to thrill, but also perhaps to illustrate the dangers of the unknown world beyond the familiar shores. For a people whose lives were often tied to the sea, these stories offered a way to conceptualize and cope with the perils of maritime travel. The enduring power of the Odyssey, even in its written form, lies in its ability to resonate with universal human experiences. Who has not felt the longing for home, the struggle against overwhelming odds, the temptation of distraction, or the joy of reunion. Odysseus's journey is not just a physical one across treacherous seas. It is also a metaphorical journey of self-discovery, of confronting one's past, and of reclaiming one's identity. He returns not as the same man who left for Troy, but as one tempered by suffering and wisdom, a true survivor. The process by which these oral traditions coalesced into the epic poems attributed to Homer is still a subject of intense scholarly research. Some theories suggest a period of monumental composition, where a highly skilled poet, perhaps working with scribes, meticulously crafted the vast narrative from existing oral themes and episodes. Others propose a more gradual crystallization, where a particularly popular and well-formed version of the tale was eventually deemed worthy of transcription. Regardless of the exact mechanism, the moment these stories were committed to writing marked a profound shift, transforming them from fleeting performances into enduring literary works, accessible to future generations in a fixed, immutable form. This act of preservation ensured that the echoes of those ancient bards and the values of their time would continue to whisper through the ages. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The whispers of the Aegean, carried on the salt-laced wind, began to coalesce into something more tangible, more enduring, as the centuries turned. From the swirling currents of oral tradition, where tales were fluid, shifting with each bard's breath, a monumental force began to shape the very essence of what we now know as the Odyssey. This force, whether a singular towering genius or a collective spirit of poetic brilliance, is known to us as Homer. Imagine the flickering firelight in a great hall, perhaps in Ionia, sometime around the 8th century BCE. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and the murmur of anticipation. A figure, perhaps an old man with eyes that seem to hold the wisdom of generations, takes up his lyre. He doesn't invent the stories from thin air. Rather, he is a master weaver, drawing threads from a vast tapestry of existing myths, legends, and hero songs. These were the raw materials. The cunning hero, the perilous journey home, the faithful wife, the vengeful gods. These elements had been sung in countless variations for centuries, passed down from one generation of bards to the next, each adding their own flourish, each adapting the tale to their audience. Homer's genius, then, was not in creation ex nihilo, but in the meticulous, almost architectural, structuring of this sprawling oral material. He took the episodic adventures, the scattered narratives of Odysseus's wanderings, and forged them into a coherent, compelling epic. It was a conscious act of literary craftsmanship, a monumental undertaking that transformed fleeting performances into a work of enduring art. He gave it a beginning, a middle, and an end, not in a simple linear fashion, but with a sophisticated narrative technique that was revolutionary for its time. Consider the opening lines, the invocation of the muse. This wasn't merely a poetic flourish. It was a declaration of intent, a framing device that immediately elevated the tale to a sacred, divinely inspired plane. Tell me, muse, of the man of many ways who has driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. This single line sets the stage, introducing the hero, his defining characteristic, his resourcefulness, his many ways, and the central theme of his suffering and wandering. It is a masterstroke of conciseness, immediately drawing the listener into the heart of the narrative. One of the most striking innovations attributed to Homer is the concept of nostos, the longing for home. While the idea of returning from war was certainly present in earlier traditions, Homer elevates nostos to a central, almost spiritual quest. It is more than just a physical journey. It is a journey of identity, a yearning for belonging, for the restoration of order and self. Odysseus is not merely trying to get back to Ithaca. He is trying to reclaim his place, his family, his very essence. This profound exploration of home and belonging resonates across millennia, making the Odyssey eternally relevant. Another testament to Homer's structural mastery is his use of flashback. Instead of beginning the story with Odysseus's departure from Troy, he plunges us in medias res into the middle of the action. Odysseus is already held captive on Calypso's island, his journey largely behind him. It is only later, when he recounts his adventures to the Phaeacians, that we learn the full scope of his trials. This narrative technique builds suspense, allows for a more immediate engagement with the hero's plight, and demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of storytelling that was far ahead of its time. It's a trick that countless storytellers have adopted since. From ancient playwrights to modern filmmakers, historians still debate whether Homer was a single blind poet, perhaps like the bards he describes, or if the name represents a school of poets, a collective tradition that refined and eventually codified these epic tales. The sheer consistency of style, the intricate interlocking of themes, and the masterful use of recurring epithets and formulaic phrases suggest a single guiding hand, or at least a very tightly controlled artistic process. Yet the vastness of the Iliad and the Odyssey, their immense scope and detail, make it difficult to imagine one individual composing them entirely from scratch in an age before widespread literacy. Perhaps, as some scholars suggest, a brilliant poet, whom we call Homer, was the final redactor, the one who took the best versions of these oral tales and committed them to a more fixed form, perhaps even dictating them for transcription. This would have been a monumental undertaking, akin to compiling and editing a vast oral encyclopedia into a coherent narrative. The transition from purely oral performance to written text was a slow and gradual process, occurring over centuries. While the Odyssey was undoubtedly composed for oral performance, its sheer length and complexity suggest that at some point it must have been written down. The development of the Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician script around the 9th or 8th century BCE, provided the means for such a monumental literary undertaking. It is plausible that Homer, or the Homeric school, was at the forefront of this revolution, using the newly available technology of writing to preserve and perfect these epic poems. This would have allowed for a level of structural integrity and detailed composition that would have been incredibly difficult to maintain through purely oral transmission. Consider a lesser-known detail about the Odyssey's composition: the role of epithets. These are not merely decorative adjectives, but functional elements, often used to help the bard maintain rhythm and meter during performance. Phrases like rosy-fingered Dawn, wise Odysseus, or swift-footed Achilles were not just poetic, they were mnemonic devices, helping the bard recall the next line or phrase in the heat of performance. Homer, however, elevates these formulaic elements, using them not just for convenience, but for characterization and thematic emphasis. Resourceful Odysseus isn't just a label, it's a constant reminder of his defining trait, his ability to adapt and overcome. The very concept of a text as we understand it, a fixed and unchanging work, was still nascent. Even after being written down, copies would have been made by hand, often with variations. The Odyssey we read today is the product of centuries of transmission, editing, and scholarly work, culminating in the standardized versions we have from Hellenistic Alexandria onward. Yet the core structure, the narrative arc, and the profound themes that Homer imbued into the poem have remained remarkably consistent, a testament to their inherent power and the meticulous care with which they were crafted. The Odyssey, therefore, is not just a collection of exciting adventures. It is a deeply psychological exploration of human identity, resilience, and the relentless pull of home. It delves into themes of disguise and recognition, loyalty and betrayal, justice and revenge. Odysseus's journey is as much an internal one as it is external. He returns to Ithaca not as the triumphant warrior, but as a beggar, testing the loyalty of his household, reclaiming his kingdom through cunning and strength. This elaborate plot, with its twists and turns, its moments of profound emotion and thrilling action, is the hallmark of Homer's unparalleled narrative skill. Perhaps these ancient halls, where the Odyssey was first performed or dictated, still echo with the sound of the lyre and the voice of the bard. Perhaps the very stones absorbed the tales of gods and heroes, of monstrous encounters and tender reunions. The meticulous care with which Homer structured this epic, transforming fleeting oral traditions into an enduring literary masterpiece, laid the foundation for Western literature. It was a bridge from the fluid world of spoken word to the more permanent realm of the written text, the transition that would profoundly shape the way stories were told and preserved for all time. The Odyssey, born from the collective memory of a people, was given its immortal form by a master craftsman, whose hand, whether singular or collective, sculpted the very essence of Nostos and human identity into an epic that continues to resonate with us today. The whispers of the Odyssey, once etched onto fragile papyrus, faced their greatest challenge not from the ravages of time alone, but from the very medium that sought to preserve them. For centuries, the epic had existed primarily as scrolls, long rolls of papyrus, carefully written in columns, read by unrolling one end and rolling up the other. Imagine the scene, a scholar in Alexandria perhaps, unrolling a section of the Odyssey, the dry rustle of papyrus, a constant companion to the rhythmic cadence of the verses. These scrolls, though revolutionary for their time, were inherently delicate. They cracked, frayed, and disintegrated with repeated handling, and their linear format made cross-referencing or quick navigation incredibly difficult. A reader wishing to revisit a specific line had to laboriously unroll and re-roll, searching for the desired passage. Then came a transformation, subtle at first, but ultimately profound. The shift from scroll to codex. The codex, a stack of folded sheets bound together along one edge, what we recognize today as a book, began to emerge in the Roman world around the 1st century CE. Its advantages were immediately apparent. It was more compact, easier to handle, and far more durable than a scroll. You could open it to any page instantly, allowing for non-linear reading and easier comparison of passages. For the Odyssey, this meant a new lease on life, a physical form that could withstand the centuries of transmission that lay ahead. Yet this transition was not without its complexities. Each time the Odyssey was copied from a papyrus scroll onto the pages of a new vellum codex, vellum being a refined form of animal skin, smooth and incredibly durable, it was a painstaking manual process. Scribes, often working in monastic scriptoria, became the unsung heroes of its survival. They sat for hours, sometimes days, meticulously transcribing every word, every line, by hand. The flickering lamplight might cast long shadows on their work, their quills scratching softly against the prepared animal hide. These were not mere mechanical reproductions. Each scribe brought their own human element to the task. Consider the immense labor involved. A complete copy of the Odyssey would have filled many scrolls, and then, later, several substantial codices. The sheer volume of text, over 12,000 lines, meant that even the most dedicated scribe would face fatigue, distractions, and the inevitable human error. A momentary lapse of concentration, a misheard word if dictating, a slip of the quill, or even a simple misunderstanding of an archaic term could introduce a subtle variation. Sometimes, a scribe might encounter a passage that seemed unclear or damaged in their source text, and in an attempt to make sense of it, they might inadvertently correct it or even omit a section they couldn't decipher. These seemingly minor alterations, accumulating over centuries and through countless copying cycles, led to what scholars call textual variance. This is where the fascinating and often challenging field of textual criticism comes into play. Imagine a detective story spanning millennia, where the clues are not fingerprints, but faint ink marks on ancient pages. When modern scholars study the Odyssey, they don't have a single, definitive, original manuscript written by Homer himself. Instead, they have hundreds of surviving manuscripts, ranging from fragmented papyri dating back to Antiquity to beautifully illuminated medieval codices. Each of these manuscripts, while largely consistent, contains these subtle differences: a word spelled differently, a line omitted, an extra word added, a different grammatical construction. Historians still debate whether the earliest written versions of the Odyssey were already subject to significant variations even before the great libraries began collecting and standardizing texts. Some scholars believe that during the long period of oral transmission, before the epic was widely committed to writing, there were multiple performance versions of the Odyssey, each slightly different depending on the rhapsode and their audience. When these oral traditions were finally written down, perhaps multiple times in different locations, it's plausible that these initial written forms already diverged. The process of copying, then, would have simply amplified these existing variations. One lesser-known detail about this transmission process is the role of marginalia. Scribes and later readers would often write notes in the margins of their codices. These notes, known as scholia, could be anything from simple corrections of perceived errors to explanations of difficult words or mythological references, to even personal opinions or observations about the text. While invaluable for understanding how the Odyssey was interpreted and studied throughout history, these marginal notes sometimes became inadvertently incorporated into the main text by later scribes who mistook them for part of the original composition. Imagine a future copyist seeing a note in the margin that says, "This line seems out of place," and then, in their own copy, simply omitting the line altogether, thinking it was a correction meant for the main text. This layered history of reading and interpretation adds another fascinating dimension to the textual puzzle. The transition from papyrus to vellum and from scroll to codex wasn't just a technological shift, it was a cultural one. The Codex made the Odyssey more accessible, more durable, and more conducive to serious scholarly study. It allowed for the creation of indices, glossaries, and commentaries, transforming the epic from a performance text into a literary object to be analyzed and cross-referenced. By the 4th century CE, the Codex had largely replaced the scroll as the dominant form for books, and the Odyssey was firmly ensconced in this new, more robust format. This period, roughly from the 4th to the 6th centuries, saw a concerted effort in late antiquity to consolidate and preserve classical texts, often within Christian monastic communities who saw value in the literary heritage of the past, even if the content was pagan. The survival of the Odyssey through the turbulent centuries of the early Middle Ages is a testament to its enduring power and the dedication of these anonymous scribes. While much of classical literature was lost during this period of societal upheaval and decline in literacy, the Odyssey, along with other foundational texts, was carefully safeguarded within the walls of monasteries. Monks, often living in remote and isolated communities, continued the laborious work of copying, sometimes for the sheer love of learning, sometimes as a spiritual discipline, and sometimes simply because it was their assigned task. They were the silent guardians of knowledge, their hands guiding the quill across the vellum, preserving not just words, but entire worlds of thought and imagination. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, echoing the ancient verses as the scribes worked through the long nights. The scent of parchment, ink, and beeswax would have filled the scriptoria, creating an atmosphere of quiet reverence for the texts being preserved. Each finished codex was a precious artifact, often adorned with intricate illuminations and sturdy bindings, a treasure to be carefully guarded in the monastic library. These medieval copies, though generations removed from the earliest papyri, became the primary lineage through which the Odyssey would eventually reach the Renaissance and the age of printing. The challenge for modern textual critics, then, is to peel back these layers of transmission, to analyze the variations across hundreds of manuscripts, and to attempt to reconstruct the text as close as possible to its original form. This involves comparing different readings, identifying common errors that suggest a shared ancestor manuscript, and using linguistic and stylistic analysis to determine which reading is most likely to be Homeric. It's a bit like tracing a family tree, but instead of people, you're tracing words and phrases, looking for the common ancestor of all the surviving branches. It's a monumental task, but one that ensures the Odyssey we read today, while not perfectly identical to what was first sung or written, is as close as humanly possible to the epic that captivated ancient audiences and continues to enchant us now. The journey of the Odyssey, from fragile scroll to sturdy codex, is a silent epic in itself, a testament to the enduring human desire to preserve and pass on stories that resonate across time. As the flickering lamplight of the medieval monasteries began to wane, a new dawn, vibrant and full of curiosity, began to break over Europe. This was the Renaissance, a period of profound rebirth, a reawakening of classical ideals that had slumbered for centuries. And at the heart of this intellectual ferment, the Odyssey, like a long-lost friend, was about to be rediscovered with an intensity unlike ever before. For much of the Middle Ages in Western Europe, the Odyssey had been known primarily through Latin summaries and fragmented allusions. Homer's original Greek, a language that had once been the lingua franca of the ancient world, had become largely inaccessible in the West. But in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, the flame of Greek scholarship had continued to burn brightly, preserving countless ancient texts, including the complete works of Homer. Then came the year 1453. The mighty walls of Constantinople, the last bastion of the Roman Empire in the East, fell to the Ottoman Turks. This cataclysmic event, though tragic for the Byzantines, inadvertently triggered a magnificent intellectual migration. Scholars, monks, and refugees, fleeing the conquered city, carried with them their most precious possessions. Not gold or jewels, but ancient Greek manuscripts. These precious cargo, often bundled in rough cloth and carried across perilous seas, began to arrive in the burgeoning intellectual centers of Italy, Florence, Venice, Rome. It was as if a hidden spring had suddenly burst forth, flooding the thirsty lands of Western Europe with the pure waters of classical Greek thought. Among these treasures were multiple copies of the Odyssey, complete and in its original language, some painstakingly copied over centuries by generations of Byzantine scribes. The arrival of these manuscripts was nothing short of a revelation. For centuries, Western scholars had relied on Latin translations or second-hand accounts of Greek philosophy and literature. Now they could read the masters themselves, in their own words. The Odyssey, with its intricate plot, vivid characterizations, and profound exploration of human experience, immediately captivated the Renaissance mind. It spoke to an age fascinated by exploration, human ingenuity, and the pursuit of knowledge. The figure of Odysseus, the resourceful, cunning, and endlessly curious traveler, resonated deeply with the spirit of the age, an era that saw the beginnings of global exploration and a renewed interest in individual achievement. One of the most influential figures in this rediscovery was the Byzantine scholar Manuel Chrysoloras, who arrived in Florence in the late 14th century, even before the final fall of Constantinople. He taught Greek to eager Italian students, effectively reintroducing the language to Western Europe. His students, in turn, became the first generation of Renaissance humanists who could truly appreciate the Odyssey in its original form. They were not just translators, they were interpreters, delving into the nuances of Homer's language, the subtleties of his poetic rhythm, and the profound philosophical implications of his epic. The sheer beauty of Homer's verse, previously lost in translation, now shone through, inspiring a new generation of poets and writers. The rediscovery of the Odyssey profoundly influenced nascent literary traditions across Europe. In Italy, poets like Ludovico Ariosto, in his epic Orlando Furioso, wove elements of Homeric journey and adventure into his own tales of chivalry and magic. Though set in a different world, the echoes of Odysseus's trials and triumphs can be heard in the wandering heroes and their encounters with fantastical creatures. Later, in England, the poet Edmund Spenser in his Faerie Queene also drew upon the classical epic tradition, creating a sprawling allegorical poem that owes much to the narrative techniques perfected by Homer. The very structure of the epic poem, with its long journeys, divine interventions, and trials of character, became a model for European literature for centuries to come. Beyond literature, the Odyssey also played a crucial role in the development of humanistic thought. Humanism, the intellectual movement at the heart of the Renaissance, emphasized the value and agency of human beings, focusing on human potential and achievements rather than divine intervention. Odysseus, with his reliance on his own intelligence, resilience, and adaptability, became a quintessential humanist hero. He was not a demigod, but a mortal man who navigated a world filled with gods and monsters through sheer wit and determination. His journey was seen as an allegory for the human condition, a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. This emphasis on individual agency and the pursuit of knowledge, so central to the Odyssey, resonated deeply with the humanist ideal of virtue, the idea of excellence and moral strength. However, the interpretation of Odysseus himself was not without its complexities. While admired for his cunning and resourcefulness, his notorious trickery and occasional deception also sparked debate. Historians still disagree whether the Renaissance fascination with Odysseus was primarily due to his heroic qualities or his more pragmatic, even Machiavellian traits. Was he seen as the ideal leader, capable of navigating treacherous political waters with skill and foresight? Or was there a subtle critique embedded in his less noble actions? Perhaps this very ambiguity made him all the more compelling to a generation grappling with the complexities of power and morality in a rapidly changing world. The influx of Greek manuscripts also spurred the development of printing technology. Aldus Manutius, a Venetian printer, dedicated his life to publishing accurate editions of classical Greek texts. His Aldine Press, founded in 1494, became a beacon of scholarship, producing the first complete printed edition of Homer's works, including the Odyssey, in 1504. This was a monumental achievement, making the epic accessible to a far wider audience than ever before. No longer confined to the rare and expensive handwritten copies, the Odyssey could now be studied, debated, and enjoyed by scholars and educated individuals across Europe, further accelerating its influence. Imagine the sheer wonder of holding a printed book, a clean, uniform text, after centuries of relying on handwritten scrolls and codices. It was a revolution in itself, and Homer was at its forefront. The Odyssey's influence extended beyond the written word. Artists, inspired by the vivid descriptions in the epic, began to depict scenes from Odysseus's journey. Frescoes and paintings adorned palaces and churches, bringing to life the Cyclops, the Sirens, and the return to Ithaca. These visual interpretations further cemented the Odyssey's place in the popular imagination, making its stories accessible even to those who could not read. The narrative of the long journey home, the trials faced, and the ultimate reunion became a powerful metaphor for life's own challenges and triumphs. One lesser-known detail from this period is the sheer effort involved in the translation process. Early Renaissance translators often worked in difficult conditions, sometimes with incomplete or damaged manuscripts and without the benefit of comprehensive lexicons or grammatical aids. They were pioneers, often learning Greek from scratch, driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge. The first Latin translation of the Odyssey, directly from the Greek, completed by Lorenzo Valla in the mid-15th century, was a Herculean task, taking years of meticulous work. These early translations, though sometimes imperfect by modern standards, were crucial bridges, allowing the epic to cross the linguistic divide and once again speak to the Western world. The Renaissance rediscovery of the Odyssey was not just about finding old books, it was about finding a new way of seeing the world. It was about embracing human potential, celebrating intellectual curiosity, and recognizing the enduring power of storytelling. The epic, with its tales of adventure, its exploration of identity, and its profound understanding of the human spirit, resonated deeply with an age that was itself embarking on a grand voyage of discovery. Perhaps these ancient words, carried across seas and mountains, whispered stories of resilience and hope to the eager minds of the Renaissance, inspiring them to chart new courses, both intellectual and geographical, and to believe in the boundless possibilities of human endeavor. The Odyssey, like a seasoned traveler, had found its way home once more, ready to inspire a new chapter in its long and winding journey through human history. The flickering lamplight of the Enlightenment cast long, curious shadows across ancient scrolls, inviting a new kind of scrutiny, a fresh, intellectual dawn. As the 18th century unfurled its banners of reason and empirical inquiry, the Odyssey, like so many other venerable texts, found itself placed under the meticulous lens of burgeoning scholarship. No longer was it solely a tale for moral instruction or poetic inspiration. It became an artifact, a puzzle to be solved, a linguistic tapestry to be unraveled thread by painstaking thread. This era, characterized by a fervent belief in the power of human intellect to illuminate the darkest corners of ignorance, approached the Odyssey with a rigor previously unknown, laying the foundational stones for what we now recognize as modern classical philology. The initial tremors of this intellectual shift could be felt even in the preceding centuries, but it was in the Enlightenment that they truly became an earthquake. Scholars, armed with new printing technologies and a growing network of intellectual exchange, began to compare manuscripts with an unprecedented precision. They sought to establish what they called a critical edition, a text as close as possible to the original, purged of the errors and interpolations that had accumulated over millennia of copying. This was not a task for the faint of heart. It involved sifting through countless variations, weighing the merits of a single misplaced letter, and often making difficult editorial decisions based on linguistic patterns and historical context. It was a slow, deliberate process, much like an archaeologist carefully brushing away layers of earth to reveal a buried city. One of the most significant figures in this early phase was Richard Bentley, an English classical scholar of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Bentley, known for his formidable intellect and often abrasive personality, applied a demanding critical method to classical texts, including Homer. While his specific textual emendations to the Odyssey might now be debated, his insistence on a scientific, evidence-based approach to textual criticism was revolutionary. He challenged long-held assumptions, arguing that even revered ancient texts were susceptible to corruption and needed rigorous scrutiny. His work, though sometimes controversial in his own time, underscored a fundamental shift. The Odyssey was no longer sacrosanct in its every syllable, but a document subject to human fallibility and historical change. As the 18th century progressed, the focus sharpened, and a profound question began to emerge from the meticulous textual work, the Homeric question. This was not a simple query, but a complex web of interconnected debates that sought to understand the very nature of the Odyssey's authorship and composition. For centuries, the prevailing belief had been that a single, blind poet named Homer had composed both the Iliad and the Odyssey in their entirety. But as scholars delved deeper into the linguistic nuances, the stylistic variations, and the historical inconsistencies within the poems, doubts began to surface. The most famous catalyst for the Homeric question was Friedrich August Wolff, a German philologist whose influential work, Prolegomena ad Homerum, published in 1795, presented a systematic challenge to the unitary authorship theory. Wolff argued that the Odyssey, along with the Iliad, could not have been composed by a single individual in the form we know them today. He pointed to several key observations: the lack of writing in Homer's supposed era, suggesting oral composition, the presence of linguistic inconsistencies and anachronisms that hinted at different layers of composition, and the sheer length and complexity of the poems, which seemed to defy individual memorization and transmission without significant alteration. Wolff proposed that the Homeric epics were originally a collection of shorter, independent oral songs or lays composed by various poets over generations. These individual pieces, he theorized, were later gathered, arranged, and perhaps expanded upon by a series of redactors or editors, eventually coalescing into the unified narratives we possess. This theory, often called the analyst position, fundamentally reshaped how scholars viewed the Odyssey. It transformed Homer from a singular, divinely inspired poet into a more abstract concept, perhaps a name associated with a tradition rather than an individual. The Homeric question ignited a passionate and enduring debate that continues in various forms to this day. On one side were the analysts who sought to dissect the poems, identifying different strata of composition, different authors, and different periods of accretion. They meticulously cataloged repetitions, inconsistencies in character portrayal, and shifts in narrative focus, all as evidence of multiple hands at work. They might point, for instance, to the apparent geographical discrepancies in Odysseus's journey, suggesting different traditions or stories were woven together, or to subtle shifts in the portrayal of gods or heroes that seemed to reflect evolving cultural perspectives. Opposing them were the Unitarians, who argued for the fundamental artistic unity of the Odyssey. While acknowledging the possibility of oral transmission and some minor interpolations, they maintained that the overall coherence, the intricate plot, the consistent character development, and the overarching thematic unity pointed strongly to a single creative genius. They argued that apparent inconsistencies could be explained by poetic license, the demands of oral performance, or even the subtle evolution of a single artist's vision. A Unitarian might emphasize the masterful way Odysseus's character arc unfolds, from the proud warrior to the patient, cunning survivor, suggesting a singular artistic intention guiding his journey home. This scholarly dispute was not merely an academic exercise. It had profound implications for how the Odyssey was understood and appreciated. Was it a patchwork? Was its artistic merit diminished? If it was the product of a single mind, what did that reveal about the human capacity for epic creation in an age without writing? The debates were often fierce, conducted through weighty scholarly tomes and heated academic conferences. They pushed the boundaries of textual analysis, linguistic study, and historical reconstruction. Beyond the grand question of authorship, the Enlightenment scholars also delved into the minutiae of the Odyssey's language. They meticulously studied its archaic Greek, comparing it to later forms of the language, tracing the evolution of words and grammatical structures. They were, in essence, linguistic detectives, piecing together clues from vocabulary and syntax to understand the poem's origins and its journey through time. This philological work was painstaking, often requiring deep knowledge of obscure dialects and ancient metrics. They would count syllables, analyze rhythmic patterns, and identify recurring epithets, all in an effort to understand the mechanics of Homeric poetry. One lesser-known detail that emerged from this period of intense scrutiny was the recognition of the formulaic nature of Homeric poetry. Scholars began to observe the pervasive use of fixed phrases and recurring epithets, such as rosy-fingered Dawn or swift-footed Achilles. While earlier generations might have simply appreciated these as poetic flourishes, Enlightenment philologists started to understand their deeper function. They realized these formulas were not merely decorative, but were essential tools for oral poets, allowing them to compose and improvise long narratives in real time. These ready-made phrases provided rhythmic and metrical building blocks, enabling the poet to construct verses on the fly, much like a musician improvising with pre-learned melodic pattern. So this insight, though fully developed later in the 20th century by scholars like Milman Parry and Albert Lord, had its nascent beginnings in the detailed linguistic analysis of the Enlightenment. The establishment of critical editions was another monumental achievement of this era. Scholars like Johann Heinrich Voss, whose German translation of the Odyssey in the late 18th century became a foundational text, worked tirelessly to produce versions of the poem that were as accurate and reliable as possible. These editions, often accompanied by extensive commentaries and textual notes, became the standard for subsequent generations of scholars and readers. They provided a stable, widely accepted text upon which further research and interpretation could be built. Imagine the sheer dedication required to pore over countless manuscripts, comparing every line, every word, every punctuation mark, all in an effort to reconstruct a text that had been circulating for thousands of years. It was a labor of love, driven by a profound respect for the ancient world and a desire to preserve its literary treasures. The Enlightenment's contribution to Odyssean scholarship extended beyond textual criticism and the Homeric question. It also fostered a more historically informed approach to the poem. Scholars began to ask not just who wrote it, but what was the world like when it was written. They explored the material culture described in the Odyssey, comparing it to archaeological findings, though archaeology as a systematic discipline was still in its infancy. They analyzed the social structures, religious beliefs, and legal customs depicted in the epic, seeking to place it within its proper historical context. This nascent historical approach, though often speculative due to limited evidence, marked a crucial step towards understanding the Odyssey, not just as literature, but as a window into an ancient civilization. Perhaps these diligent scholars, hunched over their desks in dimly lit studies, felt a kinship with Odysseus himself, a shared journey of discovery, a relentless pursuit of knowledge through uncharted textual seas. They navigated the treacherous currents of linguistic ambiguity and the shifting sands of historical interpretation. The debates they sparked, particularly the Homeric question, forced a fundamental reevaluation of authorship, tradition, and the very nature of epic poetry. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment, where the Odyssey was taken apart and put back together again, examined from every conceivable angle. As the 19th century dawned, the groundwork laid by these Enlightenment philologists would continue to shape Odyssean scholarship. The questions they posed, the methods they developed, and the critical editions they produced became the bedrock upon which future generations would build. The Odyssey, once a relatively static text, had been reanimated by the spirit of inquiry, transformed into a dynamic subject of ongoing investigation. It was no longer just a story of a hero's return, but a living testament to the complexities of ancient oral traditions, the challenges of textual transmission, and the enduring power of human curiosity to unravel the mysteries of the past. The echoes of their debates still resonate in academic halls today, a testament to the profound impact of their intellectual revolution. The echoes of Odysseus's journey, once confined to ancient scrolls and bardic chants, began to resonate with a new, profound intensity as the world turned towards the age of Romanticism. This was a period, roughly spanning from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, when the human spirit yearned for something beyond the cold rationality of the Enlightenment. It sought emotion, imagination, the wild beauty of nature, and the boundless potential of the individual. And in the Odyssey, Romantic thinkers found a mirror reflecting these very ideals. No longer was Odysseus merely a cunning warrior or a divinely favored hero. He became a symbol of the solitary soul grappling with destiny, a wanderer navigating not just treacherous seas, but the tumultuous depths of his own heart. The Romantics, with their emphasis on subjective experience and the sublime, saw in his epic voyage a journey of self-discovery, a testament to resilience, and a poignant exploration of longing and homecoming. The very act of wandering, once a consequence of divine wrath, transformed into a quest for personal truth, a pilgrimage of the spirit. Poets, painters, and composers alike were captivated. Lord Byron, a quintessential romantic figure, found in Odysseus a kindred spirit, a restless, passionate individual, defying societal norms and embracing a life of adventure and introspection. Though Byron never directly adapted the Odyssey into a major work, his own wanderings across Europe, his fascination with classical lands, and his creation of brooding, Byronic heroes like Childe Harold undeniably carried the same emotional charge and sense of yearning for the distant and the profound that permeated the Homeric epic. One could almost imagine his heroes gazing out at the Aegean, feeling the same pang of homesickness that afflicted Odysseus on Calypso's isle. The allure of the Odyssey for the Romantics lay not just in its grand narrative, but in its moments of tender humanity and profound emotional resonance. The reunion with Penelope, for instance, transcended a mere plot point. It became the ultimate symbol of enduring love, fidelity, and the triumph of hope over despair. The scene where Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, is recognized by his old dog Argos became a powerful evocation of unwavering loyalty and the passage of time, a moment that could bring tears to the eyes of the most stoic romantic. These were not just stories of gods and monsters, but deeply human dramas unfolding against a backdrop of mythic grandeur. The German Romantic movement, in particular, embraced the Odyssey with a fervent intellectual and artistic passion. Figures like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, though perhaps more aligned with the classical ideal, deeply admired Homer and saw in his epics a profound understanding of the human condition. His own epic poem, Hermann and Dorothea, while set in contemporary Germany, consciously echoed the epic structure and the theme of a journey towards stability and love, albeit on a much smaller, domestic scale. The idea of the Bildungsroman, or the novel of formation, so central to German Romanticism, where a protagonist undergoes a journey of self-discovery and moral development, found a powerful ancient precedent in Odysseus's transformative voyage. Yet it was in the visual arts that the Romantic interpretation of the Odyssey truly bloomed in vibrant, often dramatic hues. J.M.W. Turner, the great English Romantic painter, was deeply inspired by classical mythology and the elemental power of the sea. His painting, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, 1829, is a breathtaking example of this. It's not merely an illustration of the myth, it's a swirling vortex of light, color, and raw emotion. The sun bursts forth in a glorious, almost violent blaze, illuminating the monstrous Cyclops in the distance and casting Odysseus's ship in a triumphant yet vulnerable glow. Turner captures the sublime terror of the encounter, the overwhelming power of nature, and the audacious spirit of the hero, all rendered with an emotional intensity that was the hallmark of Romantic art. The painting evokes not just the story, but the feeling of being present in that colossal, terrifying, and ultimately victorious moment. Other artists, like Jean-Baptiste Auguste Lelloir, depicted the more introspective and melancholic aspects of Odysseus's journey. His painting, Ulysses and Nausicaa, 1842, portrays a moment of quiet vulnerability and nascent connection, far from the roar of battle or the fury of the sea. It highlights the human element of the epic, the brief respite and the gentle kindness offered to the shipwrecked hero. This softer, more intimate portrayal resonated with the Romantic fascination for human emotion and the delicate interplay of fate and chance. The very concept of the sublime, so central to Romantic aesthetics, found fertile ground in the Odyssey. The The sublime was not merely beauty, but a beauty that inspired awe, even terror, by its vastness, power, or overwhelming scale. The roaring tempest, the monstrous whirlpool of Charybdis, the desolate, mist-shrouded land of the Cimmerians. These were scenes that evoked the sublime, reminding humanity of its smallness in the face of nature's grandeur and the mysteries of the unknown. Romantic artists and writers reveled in these descriptions, using them to stir the emotions and provoke contemplation on humanity's place in a vast, often terrifying universe. However, historians still disagree on the precise extent to which the Romantics viewed Odysseus as a purely individualistic figure, or if they still acknowledged the underlying threads of divine intervention and communal responsibility that are so woven into the original epic. While the emphasis shifted towards personal struggle and emotional depth, the ancient world's understanding of fate and the gods could not be entirely erased. Some scholars argue that the Romantics selectively interpreted the Odyssey, highlighting elements that fit their worldview while downplaying those that did not. Others contend that the very act of reinterpretation was a natural evolution, allowing the timeless themes to resonate with a new generation. One lesser-known detail from this period reveals the depth of this romantic engagement. Samuel Butler, a Victorian polymath, famously argued in his 1897 work, The Authoress of the Odyssey, that the epic was written by a young Sicilian woman, possibly Nausicaa herself, and that the geography of the poem perfectly matched the western coast of Sicily. While this theory was largely dismissed by classical scholars, it perfectly encapsulates the Romantic era's willingness to challenge established norms, to seek new perspectives, and to imbue ancient texts with a fresh, imaginative, and often deeply personal interpretation. It was a bold, almost audacious reimagining of authorship, driven by a desire to find a more relatable human origin for such a profound work. The Odyssey also provided a rich tapestry for the burgeoning field of comparative mythology, which gained traction during the Romantic era. Scholars and poets began to see parallels between Odysseus's journey and other heroic narratives from different cultures, fostering a sense of universal human experience. The idea of the hero's journey, though not fully articulated until much later, began to take shape as thinkers recognized common archetypes and narrative patterns across diverse mythologies. This comparative approach underscored the Odyssey's enduring relevance as a foundational story of human struggle and triumph. Perhaps these romantic interpretations, with their focus on emotion and individual experience, helped to democratize the Odyssey, making it accessible and deeply moving to a wider audience than ever before. It moved beyond the confines of academic study and became a living, breathing narrative capable of inspiring profound personal reflection. The ancient hero, once a figure of distant myth, was brought closer, his struggles and triumphs echoing the universal human condition. The Romantics, in their passionate embrace of imagination and feeling, ensured that the Odyssey would not merely be remembered as a historical text, but would continue to live and breathe as a vibrant source of inspiration for generations to come. A testament to the enduring power of storytelling to capture the very essence of what it means to be human. They understood that the journey of Odysseus was not just a physical one across the wine-dark sea, but an internal odyssey of the soul, a timeless exploration of longing, loss, and the eternal quest for home. As the centuries turned and the echoes of ancient Greece faded into the distant hum of industrial looms and steam engines, a new world began to take shape, one defined by vast empires and rigid moral frameworks. The 19th century, particularly in Britain, saw the Odyssey re-emerge not just as a classical text, but as a mirror reflecting the aspirations and anxieties of the Victorian age. This was a time when the British Empire spanned the globe, its ships sailing to every corner, its influence reaching into diverse cultures, much like Odysseus's own far-flung journeys. The Victorians, with their strong emphasis on duty, domesticity, and imperial expansion, found much to admire in the hero of Ithaca. Odysseus's resourcefulness, his cunning, and his unwavering determination to return home resonated deeply with a society that valued self-reliance and perseverance above all else. He was seen as the quintessential man of action, capable of navigating treacherous seas and outwitting formidable foes, much like the British explorers and administrators who were charting new territories and imposing order on distant lands. The tales of his encounters with mythical creatures and exotic peoples could be subtly reinterpreted through the lens of colonial encounters, where the unknown was to be explored, understood, and ultimately brought under control. Yet, this admiration was often filtered through a distinctly Victorian moral sensibility. The more ambiguous aspects of Odysseus's character, his moments of deception, or his dalliances with figures like Calypso and Circe, were often downplayed or recontextualized. Instead, the focus shifted to his ultimate loyalty to Penelope and his enduring desire for hearth and home. This emphasis on domestic fidelity and the sanctity of the family unit aligned perfectly with Victorian ideals. Odysseus's long absence, his trials, and his eventual return to restore order to his household became a powerful narrative of enduring love and moral rectitude. He was not just a clever adventurer, but a responsible patriarch, a king whose primary duty was to his kingdom and his family. Indeed, the very concept of home in the Odyssey took on new layers of meaning for the Victorians. For a nation that prided itself on its stable social structures and its burgeoning middle class, the idea of returning to a well-ordered domestic sphere after a period of chaos and adventure was profoundly appealing. Penelope, waiting patiently and faithfully, became an archetype of the ideal Victorian woman, virtuous, steadfast, and devoted to her husband and household. Her weaving and unweaving of Laertes' shroud, a symbol of her cunning and fidelity, was celebrated as a feminine counterpart to Odysseus's masculine exploits. One of the most significant figures in shaping the Victorian understanding of the Odyssey was Alfred Lord Tennyson, whose poem Ulysses, published in 1842, offered a poignant and enduring interpretation of the hero. Tennyson's Ulysses, however, is not the Odysseus who has just returned home and re-established his rule. Instead, he is an aging king, restless and yearning for new adventures, declaring, "I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees." This portrayal captured a different facet of the Victorian spirit, the insatiable drive for exploration, knowledge, and expansion that characterized the Age of Empire. While Odysseus's return was celebrated, Tennyson's poem tapped into the underlying wanderlust and ambition that fueled Britain's global reach. It suggested that even after achieving one's goals, the true spirit of a great man lay in the perpetual pursuit of new horizons, a sentiment that resonated with the architects of the vast British Empire. The educational reforms of the 19th century further cemented the Odyssey's place in the British consciousness. Classical education remained a cornerstone of elite schooling, and Homer's epics were central to this curriculum. Boys at public schools like Eton and Harrow would have studied the Greek text, translating its verses and absorbing its narratives. This rigorous engagement with the original language fostered a deep familiarity with the story, imbuing it with a sense of timeless authority. However, the interpretations presented in these educational settings often reinforced the prevailing moral and imperial narratives. Odysseus's leadership qualities, his ability to command men, and his strategic thinking were highlighted as virtues essential for future leaders of the empire. Consider the prevailing attitudes towards savagery and civilization in the Victorian era. The encounters Odysseus has with the Cyclops, the Sirens, or the Lotus Eaters could be seen as allegories for the civilizing mission of the British Empire. Just as Odysseus brought order and reason to chaotic or barbaric lands, so too did the Victorians believe they were bringing progress, law, and Christianity to the uncivilized parts of the world. The Cyclops, with his brute strength and lack of hospitality, could be viewed as a representation of the untamed wilderness and its primitive inhabitants, while Odysseus, with his intellect and cunning, embodied the superior rationality of Western civilization. Interestingly, this period also saw the rise of archaeological endeavors that began to unearth the physical remnants of the ancient world. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy in the 1870s, though controversial in their methods, ignited public imagination and seemed to confirm the historical basis of Homer's tales. The discovery of what Schliemann claimed were the treasures of Priam and the walls of ancient Troy gave a tangible reality to the epic poems, further solidifying their importance in the popular imagination. While Schliemann focused more on the Iliad, his work underscored the enduring power of Homer and the desire to connect with the physical world described in the epics. This desire for tangible proof, for scientific validation, was another hallmark of the Victorian age. However, not all interpretations of Odysseus were entirely flattering. Some Victorian critics, particularly those with a more cynical or realist bent, might have quietly questioned the hero's less noble actions. His deception of Polyphemus, while clever, could also be seen as a breach of hospitality, a trait highly valued in ancient Greek society. His treatment of the suitors, while justified by the narrative as retribution, was undeniably brutal. Yet these aspects were often glossed over or presented as necessary evils in the pursuit of a greater good, the restoration of order and justice. The prevailing narrative emphasized the hero's ultimate triumph and the moral righteousness of his cause. One lesser-known detail from this period is the widespread use of the Odyssey in children's literature and adaptations. Charles Lamb's The Adventures of Ulysses, 1808, was an early and influential example, simplifying the narrative and sanitizing its more adult themes for younger readers. These adaptations often amplified the heroic and moralistic aspects of the story, presenting Odysseus as a straightforward paragon of virtue and courage. This ensured that even those who did not pursue a classical education would encounter the tale, shaping their understanding of heroism and adventure from a young age. The stories of the Cyclops, Circe, and the Sirens became popular bedtime tales, subtly instilling Victorian values through ancient narratives. The scholarly dispute that quietly simmered beneath the surface of this general admiration concerned the very nature of Homeric authorship. The Homeric question, which had roots in earlier centuries but gained significant momentum in the 19th, asked whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were the work of a single poet, Homer, or the result of a long oral tradition, compiled and edited over time. German scholars, in particular, were at the forefront of this debate. Mettigue, Nowell, analyzing linguistic patterns and narrative inconsistencies to argue for multiple authors or layers of composition. This academic scrutiny, while not directly impacting the popular reception of the Odyssey as a moral tale, reflected the burgeoning scientific and analytical approach to literature and history that characterized the era. It challenged the romanticized notion of a singular, divinely inspired poet. introducing a more complex understanding of how these ancient texts came to be. Historians still disagree whether the epics were truly the product of one genius mind or the culmination of centuries of oral storytelling, a fascinating mystery that continues to invite scholarly exploration. As the 19th century drew to a close and the British Empire reached its zenith, the Odyssey remained a powerful cultural touchstone. It offered a narrative framework through which the Victorians could understand their own place in the world, a nation of intrepid explorers, cunning strategists, and moral guardians, bringing civilization to the far corners of the earth, much like Odysseus returning to bring order to his chaotic home. The epic was not just a story from a distant past. It was a living text, continually reinterpreted and reshaped to fit the prevailing ideologies of a powerful and self-confident empire. Perhaps these ancient tales, whispered across millennia, found new voices in the bustling ports and grand drawing rooms of Victorian Britain, their echoes mingling with the sounds of industry and the dreams of global dominion. The journey of Odysseus, a timeless saga of return, became, for a time, a metaphor for an empire that believed its own destiny was to bring the world home. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th began its tumultuous ascent, the world seemed to accelerate, shedding old skin with a startling, sometimes violent speed. The grand narratives that had anchored human understanding for millennia began to fray under the relentless pressures of industrialization, global conflict, and revolutionary new ways of thinking about the mind and the universe. It was in this crucible of change that the Odyssey, too, underwent a profound transformation in the collective imagination. No longer merely a heroic epic to be admired or emulated, it became a canvas upon which the anxieties and innovations of modernity were projected, deconstructed, and reassembled in startling new forms. The modernist movement, blossoming in the early decades of the 20th century, was driven by a deep sense of disillusionment with established traditions and a fervent desire to break free from conventional forms. Artists, writers, and thinkers grappled with a world that felt increasingly fragmented, where old certainties had crumbled in the wake of two devastating world wars, the rise of psychoanalysis and the dizzying pace of technological advancement. The heroic ideal, so central to the original Odyssey, seemed increasingly out of step with an age that celebrated introspection, ambiguity, and the often unheroic struggles of the individual psyche. One of the most monumental and influential reimaginings of the Odyssey came from the Irish writer James Joyce, whose epic novel Ulysses, published in 1922, stands as a towering testament to this modernist deconstruction. Joyce's ambition was audacious, to retell the entire Odyssey, not across vast seas and mythical lands, but within the confines of a single ordinary day, June 16, 1904, in the city of Dublin. His Odysseus was Leopold Bloom, a Jewish advertising canvasser, a man of quiet contemplation and mundane routines, far removed from the God-favored warrior king. His Penelope was Molly Bloom, a voluptuous and earthy singer, whose inner monologue at the novel's close is a stream of consciousness masterpiece. And his Telemachus was Stephen Dedalus, a brooding intellectual, adrift in his own artistic and philosophical quests. Joyce's genius lay in weaving the intricate tapestry of Homer's epic into the fabric of everyday life, transforming the heroic into the deeply human, and the mythical into the psychologically resonant. Each chapter of Ulysses loosely corresponds to an episode from the Odyssey, but the parallels are often ironic, subversive, or deeply symbolic. The Cyclops episode, for instance, becomes a boisterous anti-Semitic encounter in a pub, where Bloom, the outsider, faces the narrow-minded prejudices of his countrymen. The sirens are not mythical temptresses, but barmaids in a hotel, their allure rendered through the intoxicating music of language itself. Circe's spellbinding island transforms into a hallucinatory visit to a brothel, a descent into the subconscious desires and fears of Bloom and Daedalus. This radical reinterpretation shifted the focus from external adventure to internal landscape. The true journey in Ulysses is not across oceans, but through the labyrinthine corridors of the human mind. Alienation, a pervasive theme of the 20th century, permeates Bloom's experience. He is an outsider in his own city, a wanderer in his own life, much like Odysseus was an exile from Ithaca. Yet, unlike Odysseus, Bloom's heroism lies not in slaying monsters, but in enduring the quiet indignities, the fleeting joys, and the profound loneliness of modern existence. His return is not to a throne, but to his bed beside his wife, a moment of profound, if unheroic, domestic peace. The fragmentation of identity, another hallmark of modernist thought, is explored through Joyce's innovative use of stream of consciousness. The narrative shifts perspectives, dives into the unedited flow of thoughts, memories, and sensations, mirroring the fragmented nature of He modern self. There is no single unified voice, but a chorus of inner monologues, reflecting the idea that identity is not fixed but fluid, constantly constructed and deconstructed by experience. This was a direct challenge to the traditional, stable protagonist of earlier literature, including Homer's largely consistent Odysseus. While Ulysses is perhaps the most famous example, it was far from the only one. Throughout the 20th century, poets, playwrights, and novelists returned to the Odyssey, each seeking to wrestle with its enduring power and reshape it for their own times. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, published in 1922, the same year as Ulysses, echoes the theme of a fragmented journey through a desolate landscape, albeit one more symbolic of spiritual and cultural decay than a literal voyage. Though not a direct retelling, its allusions to classical myths and its exploration of urban alienation resonate with the modernist spirit that found a kindred soul in Odysseus's long, arduous return. The scholarly world, too, engaged in its own deconstruction of the Odyssey. The rise of textual criticism, archaeology, and comparative mythology led to a more nuanced understanding of the epic's origins and evolution. For instance, the long-standing Homeric question, the debate over whether Homer was a single individual or a collective name for a tradition of oral poets, gained new urgency in the 20th century. Milman Parry's groundbreaking work in the 1930s, studying oral traditions in the Balkans, provided compelling evidence for the oral formulaic nature of the Homeric epics. He argued that the repetitive epithets and formulaic phrases were not simply stylistic choices, but essential tools for illiterate bards composing long narratives on the fly. This revelation fundamentally changed how scholars viewed the Odyssey, transforming it from a static written text into the vibrant echo of a living, breathing oral tradition, a performance art passed down through generations. However, despite Parry's compelling evidence, a scholarly dispute continues to this day regarding the exact nature of the transition from oral performance to written text. While most scholars accept the oral formulaic theory, there is ongoing debate about when and how these oral poems were finally committed to writing. Was it a single scribe transcribing a performance? Was it a gradual process of dictation and revision? Or were there multiple written versions that eventually coalesced into the texts we have today? The precise mechanics of this monumental shift remain a fascinating mystery, leaving room for continued research and differing interpretations. The mid-20th century saw the Odyssey's themes re-emerge in existentialist literature, where the individual's struggle for meaning in an indifferent universe mirrored Odysseus's solitary journey. Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, while not directly referencing the Odyssey, explores the idea of finding meaning in the absurd, a concept that could be applied to Odysseus's relentless pursuit of home despite overwhelming odds. Later, in the latter half of the century, the rise of post-structuralism and deconstruction further challenged the idea of a fixed meaning in texts. Scholars began to explore the Odyssey not as a singular authoritative narrative, but as a complex interplay of voices, interpretations, and power dynamics, reflecting the anxieties and uncertainties of a world grappling with the aftermath of global conflicts and profound social shifts. In the realm of popular culture, the Odyssey continued its pervasive influence, albeit often in fragmented or highly stylized forms. Science fiction writers saw in Odysseus the ultimate space explorer, navigating uncharted cosmic waters. Fantasy authors drew inspiration from his encounters with mythical creatures, reimagining them for new worlds. Even in film, while direct adaptations were less common than in earlier periods, the spirit of the Odyssey, the long journey home, the trials of identity, the struggle against overwhelming forces, infused countless narratives, from war dramas to road movies. One lesser-known, yet intriguing interpretation of the Odyssey in the 20th century came from the realm of psychology. Carl Jung, a contemporary of Freud, developed the concept of archetypes, universal, archaic patterns and images that derive from the collective unconscious and are the psychic counterpart of instinct. He saw figures like Odysseus as embodying the hero archetype, a universal pattern of the individual's journey towards self-realization, involving separation, initiation, and return. The trials Odysseus faces, the temptations, the monsters, the loss of companions, could be seen as symbolic representations of the psychological challenges one encounters on the path to individuation. This psychological lens offered a new way to understand the epic's enduring resonance, suggesting that its power lay not just in its narrative, but in its deep connection to fundamental human experiences and psychological processes. The 20th century, therefore, did not diminish the Odyssey. Rather, it enriched it, revealing its astonishing adaptability and timeless relevance. By deconstructing its traditional heroic narrative, artists and thinkers unearthed new layers of meaning, exploring themes of alienation, psychological depth, and the fragmentation of identity that resonated deeply with the modern condition. The journey of Odysseus became a metaphor, not just for a physical voyage, but for the complex, often bewildering, inner odyssey of every individual navigating an increasingly complex world. The epic, once a fixed star in the literary firmament, became a prism, refracting the light of human experience into 1,000 new colors, each reflecting the anxieties and aspirations of a world in constant flux. The whispers of the ancient bards, carried on the winds of time, found new echoes in the cacophony of the modern city, proving that some stories, like the human spirit, are eternally capable of renewal and reinterpretation. As the 20th century drew to a close and the new millennium dawned, the very ground beneath the feet of traditional literary interpretation began to shift. A new intellectual current, often labeled postmodernism, swept through the academic landscape, bringing with it a profound skepticism towards grand narratives, universal truths, and singular meanings. For the Odyssey, this meant a radical reimagining, a fragmentation not of its physical text, but of its interpretive possibilities. The epic, once seen through the relatively stable lenses of classical philology or structuralist analysis, was now refracted through a kaleidoscope of new perspectives, each revealing different facets, often subversive, often challenging. The established readings, those that had held sway for centuries, were now subject to intense scrutiny. The heroic journey, the faithful wife, the triumphant return, these archetypes, while still present, were no longer the sole or even primary focus. Instead, postmodern approaches invited a playful, yet rigorous engagement with the text, emphasizing its inherent ambiguity, its intertextuality, and its capacity to speak to an endless array of contemporary concerns. It was as if the ancient epic, having weathered millennia, suddenly found itself in a vast, echoing hall of mirrors, each reflection offering a new, sometimes disorienting angle. One of the most significant shifts came with the rise of gender studies. For so long, the Odyssey had been read primarily as a story about men, Odysseus, Telemachus, the suitors. Women, when they appeared, were often relegated to secondary roles: the loyal wife, the seductive sorceress, the helpful princess, or the vengeful goddess. But feminist scholars began to ask different questions. What about Penelope's agency? Was her weaving and unweaving merely a delaying tactic? Or a subtle form of resistance, a quiet assertion of control in a world dominated by men? Her famous test of the bow, for instance, could be seen not just as a means to identify Odysseus, but as a clever manipulation of the suitors, a way to maintain her own power and delay the inevitable. Circe, too, was re-examined. No longer simply a dangerous enchantress, she was seen by some as a powerful, independent figure, a mistress of her own domain, who offered Odysseus not just temptation, but also crucial knowledge and guidance. Her transformation of men into pigs, once viewed as a monstrous act, could be reinterpreted as a commentary on their own beastly desires, or a symbolic act of reclaiming power from patriarchal aggression. Even the sirens, those alluring, deadly singers, began to be viewed through a different lens, as figures of untamed feminine power, their voices representing a dangerous, yet compelling, alternative to the ordered world of men. Historians of women's literature, like those exploring the works of figures such as Christine de Pizan in the 14th century, found echoes of these re-evaluations in earlier attempts to challenge male-dominated narratives, suggesting a continuous thread of questioning that finally gained widespread academic traction in the late 20th century. Post-colonial theory offered another potent lens through which to view the Odyssey. The epic, after all, is a story of exploration, encounter, and often conquest. Odysseus, the Greek hero, travels to distant lands, encounters diverse peoples, the Cyclops, the Phaeacians, the Lodophagi. From a post-colonial perspective, these encounters were no longer simply adventures. They became fraught with questions of power dynamics, cultural superiority, and the imposition of Hellenic norms. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, for example, once seen as a monstrous, uncivilized brute, could be re-evaluated as an indigenous inhabitant whose land and resources are exploited by the cunning Greek intruder. His blindness, inflicted by Odysseus, could be read as a metaphor for the colonizers' imposition of their own vision, effectively blind the native to their own way of life. The Phaeacians, too, despite their hospitality, could be seen as a society ultimately shaped by the arrival of the foreign hero, their peaceful existence disrupted by his stories of war and adventure. This perspective highlighted the often unacknowledged violence inherent in exploration and the subtle ways in which dominant cultures impose their narratives on subjugated ones. The Odyssey, in this light, became a text that could be used to deconstruct the very notion of heroism, revealing the underlying assumptions of empire and cultural hegemony. This approach resonated with broader intellectual movements of the time, such as the decolonization efforts of the mid-20th century, which sought to dismantle the legacy of European imperialism and amplify marginalized voices. Beyond gender and post-colonialism, postmodernism embraced intertextuality, the idea that no text exists in isolation, but is always in dialogue with other texts, both ancient and modern. The Odyssey became a rich tapestry of references, its threads weaving through countless works of literature, art, and music. Authors like James Joyce, whose Ulysses reimagined the epic in the streets of Dublin, or Margaret Atwood, whose Penelopiad gave voice to Penelope and her maids, were no longer seen as merely inspired by the Odyssey, but as actively rewriting it, participating in a continuous, evolving conversation. This blurring of boundaries between original and adaptation, between source and interpretation, was a hallmark of the postmodern era. The very act of reading became a creative, rather than purely receptive process. Readers were invited to become co-creators of meaning, bringing their own experiences, biases, and cultural contexts to the text. This led to a proliferation of diverse interpretations, some highly academic, others more personal and artistic. The Odyssey, in its postmodern incarnation, became a fluid, adaptable entity, capable of speaking to an ever-changing world. It was no longer a fixed monument, but a living, breathing narrative, constantly being reshaped and reinterpreted. One particularly fascinating and often debated aspect of postmodern interpretations concerned the role of the narrator and the very nature of truth within the epic. If, as postmodernism suggested, there is no single objective truth, then what about Odysseus's own tales? Are they entirely reliable? He is, after all, known for his cunning and his ability to spin a yarn. The famous tales of the Cyclops, Circe, and the Sirens, recounted by Odysseus himself to the Phaeacians, could be seen not as straightforward historical accounts, but as carefully constructed narratives designed to impress, to elicit sympathy, or even to manipulate. This raises a subtle, yet profound question. Is the Odyssey a story of truth, or a story about the power of storytelling itself? Historians still disagree whether Homer, or the collective tradition that produced the Odyssey, was consciously playing with these layers of narrative unreliability, or if such interpretations are purely modern impositions. Some classicists argue that the ancient Greek audience would have understood the tales as essentially truthful, albeit embellished accounts of heroic deeds. Others contend that the Greeks, with their sophisticated understanding of rhetoric and performance, would have appreciated the artistry of Odysseus's storytelling, even if they didn't take every detail as literal fact. The beauty of this scholarly dispute is that it doesn't diminish the epic, rather it enriches it, inviting a deeper engagement with its narrative complexities. Perhaps these ancient bards, like the poets of today, understood the subtle power of suggestion and the way a well-told story can shape perception, even if they didn't articulate it in the same theoretical terms as a 20th century literary critic. The embrace of cultural studies further broadened the scope of Odyssey scholarship. This interdisciplinary field examined the epic not just as literature, but as a cultural artifact, embedded within a complex web of social, political, and economic forces. Scholars explored how the Odyssey reflected ancient Greek values, how it shaped their understanding of the world, and how it continued to resonate in contemporary popular culture. From video games to advertising campaigns, the figures and themes of the Odyssey appeared in myriad forms, demonstrating its enduring power as a cultural touchstone. This period also saw a renewed interest in the material culture surrounding the Odyssey. While not strictly postmodern, the emphasis on context and the rejection of purely textual analysis often led to a deeper engagement with archaeological findings and historical data. For instance, the ongoing archaeological excavations at sites like Mycenae, Troy, and Ithaca, though dating back much further, continued to inform and sometimes challenge literary interpretations. The discovery of linear B tablets in the mid-20th century, offering insights into Mycenaean bureaucracy and society, provided a tangible link to the Bronze Age world that potentially inspired parts of the epic, even if the tablets themselves offered no direct mention of Odysseus. This constant interplay between the textual and the material, the literary and the archaeological, became a hallmark of late 20th and early 21st century scholarship. The postmodern era, then, was not about dismantling the Odyssey, but about liberating it from singular interpretations. It was about acknowledging its polyvocality, its capacity to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory, meanings. The epic became a vibrant, contested space, a site for ongoing intellectual exploration and creative reimagining. It embraced paradox and ambiguity, finding richness in the unresolved questions and the open-ended possibilities. This shift was profound. For centuries, the aim of scholarship had often been to uncover the definitive meaning of a text, to arrive at a consensus. Postmodernism, by contrast, celebrated the very impossibility of such a definitive reading. It reveled in the multiplicity of interpretations, recognizing that each new perspective, each new question, illuminated a different facet of the ancient story. The Odyssey became less of a fixed star and more of a constellation, its individual points of light connected by invisible threads, forming ever-shifting patterns depending on the viewer's gaze. This intellectual ferment also led to a greater appreciation for the Odyssey's adaptability. It showed how an ancient text, born in a vastly different world, could continue to speak to contemporary concerns, to reflect anxieties and hopes that transcended time. It demonstrated the epic's remarkable resilience, its ability to absorb new meanings, and to be recontextualized without losing its fundamental power. The story of Odysseus's journey home, of his struggle against forces seen and unseen, of his longing for family and belonging, proved to be a narrative template capable of infinite variation. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this postmodern turn is the invitation it extended to every reader, to engage with the Odyssey not as a passive recipient of knowledge, but as an active participant in its ongoing creation of meaning. It encouraged critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and seeking out alternative perspectives. The Odyssey, in this sense, became a living document, perpetually in flux, perpetually open to new interpretations, its ancient whispers echoing through the corridors of time, inviting endless conversation and contemplation. It was a testament to the enduring power of narrative, its capacity to transcend its original context and to find new resonance in every age. The journey of interpretation, much like Odysseus's own, proved to be an endless voyage, full of unexpected turns and profound discoveries. And so, the threads of the Odyssey, woven through millennia, continue to unfurl into the 21st century, finding new forms and voices in an ever-evolving world. The epic, far from being confined to dusty academic texts, has permeated popular culture, demonstrating its enduring relevance as a foundational narrative for exploring the human experience. Its echoes resonate in the flickering images of cinema, the interactive landscapes of video games, the pages of contemporary literature, and the ongoing dialogues of academic discourse. Consider, for instance, the cinematic interpretations that have sought to capture the essence of Odysseus's journey. While earlier adaptations, such as the 1954 Italian film Ulysses starring Kirk Douglas, offered a relatively straightforward retelling, later works began to explore more nuanced themes or transplant the narrative into new contexts. The Coen brothers' 2000 film O Brother, Where Art Thou, for example, famously reimagined the Odyssey in the Depression-era American South, transforming Odysseus into Ulysses Everett McGill, a charming but misguided convict escaping a chain gang. His companions, Pete and Delmar, become the equivalents of his loyal crew, and their encounters with sirens, a cyclops, Big Dan Teague, and a prophet, Tiresias, here a blind railwayman, are all filtered through a distinctly American folk lens. This adaptation, while humorous and musically rich, subtly underscores the timelessness of the journey home, the trials faced, and the longing for family. It's a testament to the narrative's flexibility that it can be transplanted across cultures and centuries without losing its core resonance. Beyond direct adaptations, the spirit of the Odyssey infuses countless other films. The hero's journey archetype, so clearly defined by Odysseus's trials, is a recurring motif in modern blockbusters, from science fiction epics to fantasy sagas. The return of a protagonist to a changed home, the confrontation with inner and outer demons, the reliance on wit and resilience. These narrative beats, so central to Homer's poem, continue to captivate audiences worldwide. In the realm of video games, the interactive nature of the medium offers a unique avenue for experiencing Odyssean themes. Players often embark on epic quests, navigating treacherous landscapes, encountering mythical creatures, and making choices that shape their destiny. Games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, set in ancient Greece, allow players to inhabit a world steeped in the mythology that birthed the epic, engaging with figures and locations that directly echo the poem. While not a direct retelling, it immerses players in the historical and mythological context of Odysseus's world, allowing for a more personal exploration of its lore. Other games, even those not directly tied to Greek mythology, often feature narrative structures that mirror Odysseus's long voyage home, his struggle against overwhelming odds, and his eventual triumph or tragic end. The player, much like Odysseus, must often rely on cunning, strategic thinking, and perseverance to overcome obstacles and achieve their objectives. Contemporary literature, too, continues to engage with the Odyssey, both through direct retellings and through works that draw inspiration from its themes. Margaret Atwood's The Penelopead, 2005, offers a powerful reinterpretation of the epic from the perspective of Penelope and her 12 hanged maids. This novel challenges the traditional patriarchal narrative, giving voice to those who were silenced in Homer's account, and exploring themes of loyalty, betrayal, and justice from a distinctly female viewpoint. Atwood's work is part of a broader trend in modern literature to revisit classical myths through a contemporary lens, questioning established narratives and offering alternative perspectives. Madeline Miller's Circe, 2018, similarly delves into the story of the powerful enchantress, transforming her from a mere obstacle in Odysseus's path into a complex, sympathetic character with her own journey of self-discovery and resilience. These literary explorations demonstrate a continued fascination with the characters and moral dilemmas presented in the Odyssey, inviting readers to reconsider familiar tales. Academic discourse, meanwhile, remains a vibrant arena for the study of the Odyssey. Scholars continue to debate its origins, its oral tradition, its historical context, and its profound influence on Western thought. One ongoing scholarly dispute, for instance, revolves around the Homeric question, the debate over the authorship of the Iliad and Odyssey. While the traditional view attributes both epics to a single poet named Homer, some scholars argue that they are the product of a long oral tradition, evolving over centuries through the contributions of multiple bards. The discovery of linear B tablets in the mid-20th century, which provided evidence of Mycenaean civilization and its administrative practices dating back to roughly 1450 to 1200 BCE, has further fueled discussions about the historical accuracy of certain elements within the epics, even as the poems themselves are understood to be works of poetic imagination rather than historical chronicles. Historians still disagree whether the detailed descriptions of palaces and artifacts in the epics reflect actual Mycenaean structures or are later poetic embellishments. The ongoing archaeological discoveries and linguistic analyses continue to shed new light on the world that shaped these foundational texts. Furthermore, the Odyssey is increasingly examined through new critical lenses, including post-colonial theory, feminist criticism, and eco-criticism. These approaches offer fresh insights into the poem's representations of power, gender, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. For example, some scholars now explore the concept of xenia, or guest friendship, not just as a social custom, but as a complex ethical framework that governs interactions between different cultures and peoples in the ancient world, and how its violations lead to tragic consequences. The concept of the other, and how it is portrayed in Odysseus's encounters with various non-Greek peoples, like the Cyclops or the Laestrygonians, is also a subject of intense academic scrutiny, exploring themes of ethnocentrism and cultural encounter. Even in the digital age, the fundamental human experiences explored in the Odyssey, the longing for home, the struggle against adversity, the search for identity, the perils of hubris, and the enduring power of love and loyalty, remain profoundly relevant. The poem serves as a mirror, reflecting our own journeys, our own trials, and our own aspirations. It reminds us that despite the vast technological advancements and societal shifts, the core challenges of being human have not fundamentally changed. The journey of self-discovery, the navigation of an unpredictable world, and the desire for belonging are universal themes that transcend time and culture. The Odyssey, therefore, is not merely an ancient text. It is a living narrative, continually reinterpreted and reimagined, proving its enduring power to speak to new generations. Its voyage continues, not just across the wine-dark sea, but across the vast and ever-expanding landscapes of human creativity and understanding.